A farmer in East Java pushes his plow through wet rice mud, the way his father did, and his father before him. The blade catches on something hard, not a rock. 2. For a rock. He kneels down in the water and pulls out a fragment of gold. Not a coin, not jewelry. A piece of something larger, something broken, something that was once part of a palace no one alive has ever seen. He isn't the first to find something like this. For generations, farmers across this stretch of Java have been pulling brick, statues, inscriptions, and gold out of their fields, plowing straight through the bones of a forgotten capital without knowing what lay beneath their feet. For 400 years, an empire that once claimed to rule an entire ocean of islands sat buried under rice paddies, and almost no one remembered its name. That empire was called Majapahit. At its height, it didn't just rule an island. It claimed the sea itself, the trade routes, the coastlines, the ports of 1,000 islands stretching from Sumatra to the edge of New Guinea. Ships from Majapahit's harbors carried rice, gold, and spice through waters that connected China to India, and for 100 years, its name meant power across a region larger than most European kingdoms of the same century. And then it disappeared so completely that the location of its own capital became a mystery. How does an empire that ruled the ocean vanish from memory? And why did it take farmers, plows, and pure accident to bring it back? To understand how Majapahit rose, we have to go back to a betrayal. At the end of the 13th century, the island of Java was ruled by a king named Kertanegara of the kingdom of Singhasari. Kertanegara was ambitious. He dreamed of uniting the islands around him under his own banner, and he was bold enough to provoke the most powerful empire on earth to do it. The Mongols, under Kublai Khan, had already conquered most of Asia. When Kertanegara insulted a Mongol envoy, some accounts say he mutilated the messenger's face. He was daring an empire that had crushed nations twice his size to come and answer him. But before the Mongols could arrive, a closer danger struck first. One of Kertanegara's own vassals, a ruler named Jayakatwang from the kingdom of Kadiri, saw his opportunity. While Kertanegara was distracted, Jayakatwang launched a surprise attack on the Singhasari capital. Kertanegara was killed. His kingdom collapsed in a single strike. Only one man close to the throne escaped the slaughter. His name was Raden Wijaya, a prince, a son-in-law of the fallen king, and the only person left who could carry Singhasari's claim forward. He fled into the countryside with a small group of loyal followers, hiding in forests, waiting, watching Jayakatwang consolidate power in the palace that should have belonged to him. What Raden Wijaya did next would decide the fate of an entire archipelago. Instead of raising an army of his own, an army he didn't have, he made a decision that seemed almost suicidal. He cleared land near the Brantus River, in a wilderness thick with wood apple trees so bitter the locals called them Maja. Local legend says a hungry soldier bit into one and spat it out in disgust, bitter or pahit. The settlement took its name from that bitterness, Majapahit. Then Raden Wijaya waited for the one force strong enough to destroy Jayakatwang for him. The Mongols arrived in 1293, a massive invasion fleet sent by Kublai Khan to punish Kertanegara for his insult. Never knowing Kertanegara was already dead, Raden Wijaya approached the Mongol commanders with an offer. He would guide them to Kadiri. He would help them crush Jayakatwang. In exchange, he asked only to be allowed to submit to Mongol authority afterward, as a loyal local ruler. The Mongols agreed. Together, they marched on Kadiri and destroyed it. Jayakatwang, the man who had murdered a king and stolen a throne, was defeated by the very invaders his own actions had summoned. But Raden Wijaya wasn't finished. With Kadiri gone and the Mongol army spread thin, celebrating what it believed was victory, Raden Wijaya turned on his own allies. His forces struck the Mongol camps by surprise, cutting off their retreat, forcing the shocked invaders back to their ships in chaos. The most powerful military force on the planet had just been used, discarded, and driven out by a prince with almost nothing but patience and nerve. Raden Wijaya crowned himself king. Majapahit, the settlement of bitter fruit, was now an empire. But an empire born from betrayal rarely stays peaceful for long. The early decades of Majapahit were not golden. They were violent. Trusted commanders who had helped Raden Wijaya seize the throne began to suspect each other, and eventually the king himself, of plotting against them. Rebellions broke out. Rangalaw, one of his most loyal generals, rose against him and was killed. Others followed. The court that had won its independence through cunning now spent years tearing at itself from within. It would take another generation, and one extraordinary partnership, to turn that fragile kingdom into something the world would remember. In 1331, a low-born military officer named Gajah Mada was appointed to crush yet another rebellion threatening the throne, this one from within the palace guard itself. He succeeded, and his reward and his opportunity was the position of Mahapati, Prime Minister of Majapahit. Gajah Mada did not come from nobility. He had clawed his way up through military service, through loyalty proven in blood, and now he stood at the center of power in a kingdom still bruised from decades of internal war. What he did next became legend. In front of the royal court, Gajah Mada swore an oath. He would not taste spice, some tellings say he would abstain from any pleasure at all, until every island of the Nusantara, the archipelago, bowed to Majapahit. It sounded, to some in that court, like the boast of a man who didn't understand his own limits. They underestimated him. Because Gajah Mada did not intend to conquer an ocean the way earlier kings had tried and failed, through brute force alone. He understood something more dangerous: naval power, trade leverage, and the careful use of fear. Over the following decades, Majapahit's ships and armies moved outward from Java, to Bali, to Madura, into Sumatra, pressing against the kingdoms that had once stood independent for centuries. Some fell to direct conquest. Many more simply calculated that resistance cost more than submission, and sent tribute instead. By the time Gajah Mada's oath had run its course, Majapahit's name reached ports its soldiers had never physically set foot in. A network of alliance, fear, and trade stretching from the tip of Sumatra to islands near New Guinea. Because Majapahit had not merely one architect, it, too. In 1350, a young king named Hayam Wuruk took the throne, still a teenager, inheriting a kingdom that Gajah Mada had spent nearly 20 years assembling. Together, the aging prime minister and the young king formed one of the most effective partnerships in Southeast Asian history. What followed is remembered as Java's Golden Age. Poets flourished under royal patronage. Pempu Prapanka composed the Nagarkratagama, an epic praising Hayam Wuruk's reign and cataloging, in loving detail, the vast reach of Majapahit's influence, a document that would, centuries later, become one of the only windows historians have into this empire's own self-image. Another poet, Tanchular, wrote Sutasoma, a work containing a phrase that would outlive the empire itself. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unity in diversity. 600 years later, an independent nation would adopt those words as its national motto. Trade brought wealth beyond anything Java had seen. Chinese porcelain, Indian textiles, spices from the eastern islands, and gold all moved through Majapahit's harbors. The capital at Trowulan grew into a sprawling city of canals, brick temples, and markets loud with a dozen languages. For a moment, it seemed as though Gajah Mada's impossible oath had actually been fulfilled. But historians who study this era carefully have found a harder question buried beneath the poetry. Was Majapahit truly an empire in the way we imagine empires? A state that governed, taxed, and administered distant lands directly? Or was it something looser? A core kingdom in East Java surrounded by rings of tributaries whose loyalty grew thinner the farther they sat from the capital, bound more by fear and trade than by actual control. The Narakretagama lists dozens of territories under Majapahit's sway. But a poem written to glorify a king is not the same as a tax record. Some of those conquered lands may never have seen a single Majapahit soldier. Distance, in an empire built on ships and monsoon winds, was its own kind of independence. It is one of the great unresolved debates of Southeast Asian history, and it matters because it explains what happened next. Because an empire held together by reputation as much as by force is only ever as strong as the reputation itself. And in 1357 that reputation cracked. The kingdom of Sunda in West Java had never fully submitted to Majapahit. To bring it into the fold without war, a marriage was arranged. Hayam Wuruk would marry a Sundanese princess, Daya Pitaloka, sealing an alliance through royal blood. The Sundanese royal party arrived at the field of Bubat, near the Majapahit capital, believing they were coming for a wedding. Gajah Mada saw something else. To him, the arrival of the Sundanese king on Majapahit soil was an opportunity, a chance to demand formal submission, to have Sunda surrender as a vassal rather than arrive as an equal marrying into the royal family. The Sundanese king refused the humiliation. What began as a diplomatic standoff exploded into violence. In the chaos that followed, the Sundanese royal party was slaughtered on the field of Bubat. The bride herself did not survive the disaster. A marriage meant to bring an ocean closer together instead opened a wound that never fully closed. Sunda would never submit to Majapahit. And the golden partnership between Gajah Mada and Hayam Wuruk, forged through decades of shared ambition, was never quite the same again. Gajah Mada died in 1364, still without an equal to replace him, taking with him the strategic mind that had turned an oath into an empire. Hayam Wuruk reigned on for another 25 years, but the machine his prime minister had built no longer had anyone to run it. When the king himself died in 1389, the empire he left behind had no clear heir strong enough to hold together what two extraordinary men had assembled through decades of pressure, alliance, and fear. What followed was not a single dramatic fall. It was a slow unraveling. Succession disputes tore at the royal family. A civil war, remembered as the Peregreg War, weakened the court from within during the early 15th century. Provinces that had once sent tribute out of respect or fear began quietly keeping it for themselves. And along the northern coast of Java, something new was rising. Port cities where Muslim traders from India, Arabia, and China had settled for generations, growing wealthy, growing independent, and increasingly unwilling to answer to an inland Hindu-Buddhist court that could no longer project the power it once had. One of those port cities was Demak. By the late 15th century, Demoun from a trading town into a sultanate with its own ambitions, and unlike Sunda decades earlier, it had the momentum of an entire regional shift toward Islam behind it. Where Majapahit's court still spoke the language of Hindu-Buddhist kingship, the coast was speaking a new language of faith, trade, and alliance that connected it to a wider Islamic world stretching to India and beyond. Majapahit did not fall in a single battle that historians can point to with certainty. Its final years are some of the least documented in its history, a fitting irony for an empire that once commissioned poets to record its own greatness. What is known is this: sometime around the fall of Trowulan, likely in the late 15th or early 16th century, the capital that had once controlled trade across 1,000 islands was abandoned. Its temples fell silent, its canals filled with silt, its brick walls disappeared beneath vegetation, and eventually, beneath rice paddies planted by farmers who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. The empire that had once claimed the ocean itself simply stopped being remembered by the people living on top of it. For 400 years, Majapahit existed only in fragments, in old Javanese manuscripts, in legends whispered on the island of Bali, where refugees fleeing the empire's fall carried its Hindu traditions into a new home that still practices them today. Bali, in many ways, is the last living room of a house that burned down everywhere else. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries, as Dutch colonial administrators and archaeologists began systematically excavating sites near the Brantus River, that Majapahit's physical remains were properly identified. Temple foundations, gates, and artifacts confirmed what farmers had been quietly digging up for generations. A lost capital, real and enormous, lying exactly where the old poem said it should be. And then something remarkable happened. Majapahit didn't just return as an archaeological curiosity. It returned as a symbol. When Indonesia won its independence in the 20th century, its founders reached back 6 centuries for a vision of what a unified archipelago could look like. Gajah Mada's oath to unite the Nusantara became a founding myth for a modern nation stitched together from thousands of islands and hundreds of languages. The country's first university took Gajah Mada's name. Its communication satellites were named Palapa, after the oath itself, and the phrase carved into a 14th century poem, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unity in diversity, became the motto stamped onto the national emblem of a country that didn't exist yet when those words were written. An empire built on an impossible vow, torn by its own ambition at a wedding turned massacre, buried and forgotten for 4 centuries, became, in the end, the founding story of the nation that grew from its ruins. So maybe the real question isn't how an empire that ruled the ocean disappeared. Maybe it's this: how much of what a country believes about its own past is history, and how much is a story a kingdom told about itself, a poem written to please a king, that outlived the empire it was written for and became something new entirely. The farmer, standing in his flooded field with a fragment of gold in his hand, has no way of answering that question. But the ground beneath him is still full of pieces waiting to be found.